you say something about the situation on gender identity in your country? Is there self-ID?
In Sweden, we don't have self-ID yet, at least. They have tried many times to come through with some legislations. Once we were lucky because they didn't follow the constitution. So they are doing their best to both make self-ID come true, and also they are trying to lower the ages for children for surgery, etc. also. But in Sweden, we had already 1972 the world's first law that allowed changing juridical sex. And that was for grown-up adults, transsexuals, and intersexual. And if you would get the allowance to change your sex juridically, it was following a long process, and then it was seen as a mental illness, as transsexualism. And I would say it was rather a law of mercy. The state thought that if some people actually could have a better life and stop suffer, it could be okay if they changed their sex and then try to live a better life. But there were so few people who was doing this, so it doesn't affect statistics or anything. So I can see it as a law of mercy. So far, we have the laws has not changed very much, but now it's called gender dysphoria, and the girls and boys are much younger. And also we have, for instance, in Sweden, 14-year-old girls who cut their breasts off as treatment. And recently they tried to allow 15-year-old children to have their genital surgery. But until now, we have managed to keep it from 18, which is when you're an adult in Sweden. And also we can, as many other countries, we can see that the ones who are applying for gender dysphoria are very much girls, which is a very high increase. It has changed a little bit the last 18 months because our public service television made a series of documentaries where they, for instance, managed to put the spotlight on how many girls that gender dysphoric, and also put the spotlight on that the lies about that if you don't allow the children to have surgery, etc., they will kill themselves. And these lies about high risk of suicide has been questioned. And also, so the authorities have actually started to change their minds in Sweden and have started to be a little bit more sensible about what we actually can do with our children today.
The legal situation is actually changing as we speak. Some drafts have been presented to our parliament for to introduce new self-ID laws. Outside of a legal situation, the situation is, I think, the same as in most countries, a high presence of trans advocacy on social media. Many existing women's groups, especially for young women, have already been co-opted. For example, university centers that used to look after women's and women students, demands are now completely pro-trans inclusive, and everybody states their pronouns, etc. In addition to this cooptation, there are established groups and advocacy centers in most cities, specifically addressing trans youngsters, trans teens, trans adults. Some are very closely working with our municipalities. The legal situation is that less than a fortnight ago, we had our first debate in Parliament on a drafted law on self-ID submitted by the Greens, which is essentially the same as that of our Liberal Party. Both parties are in opposition. These drafts suggest self-ID, so it would mean a change in all legal documents simply on demand. All a person has to submit is a declaration at a registry office to explain or to demand a new first name and to state what their sex is according to their own view. It would mean medical support and the financing of medical transition. It would also mean that references to a former name and identity would be penalized, and existing advocacy and support services would have to be expanded. These laws are very vague, very unspecific, and that is how a lot of this advocacy works. It looks like it's no big matter because all of the details of what might be entailed in these laws is left out. We've all had that with the Prostitution Act, which is also very short. Since 2011, any kind of hormone treatment or surgery is no longer required to change your legal documents. If people only want to change their first names, they can simply have that. If they want all legal documents to be changed, they need to submit an assessment by 2 experts, psychologists, but there is no completely formal established requirement about these experts. So people who come from trans advocacy centers and who are psychologists can write a statement, and 2 statements, and having lived for 3 years as what they think a woman is or a man is enough to obtain such a requirement. So even existing laws do not demand any kind of physical alteration, but even this assessment by 2 experts is seen as too much. LGBTQ activists and especially trans activists have already managed to institute 2 new laws, one about a 3rd option. So people who have an intersex condition, that was the intent of this law, somebody with an intersex condition that can be verified through genetic or anatomic symptoms, can change the registry and registry office papers quite easily already, and they can now opt for a 3rd gender. They can be called diverse. And trans activists have piggybacked that. So by declaring sort of strongly felt disagreement between what your physical development is and how you feel also should come under a kind of intersex condition. And now they have been using this existing law to change their papers simply by creating and then using a loophole here. So it's again a tactics piggybacking on the concerns of a specific group. A 2nd law, which has also been passed on the 7th of March, is one that prohibits conversion therapies against homosexuals. Again, piggybacking on the concerns and rising acceptance of gays and lesbians, and slipping in ideas of self-perceived gender identity. So now the law reads, medical interventions aimed at deliberately changing or suppressing the sexual orientation or self-perceived gender identity of a person, and so on, are now prohibited, penalized with a prison sentence of up to 1 year or a heavy fine. Again, they've been using a lot of blurring of language, and this law here is not only for professionals, but against anyone who talks to persons. So the ban applies to everyone. Adults or other legal guardians or persons with parental authority can also be punished in cases of gross violations of their duty of care or their educational responsibilities. But conversion therapy against gays and lesbians hasn't been a thing in Germany for decades. So suddenly now we have this law, and gender identity is being included. Interesting is also a law, a part of this law that says that treatments, I'm quoting from the official English-speaking, English language website from our Ministry of Health. So this isn't my translations, it's theirs. Treatments that help a person better express their self-perceived gender identity or their desire to acquire a more feminine or masculine physique are exempted from this ban. So, because we are always saying that transing, especially young people, is a form of conversion therapy where you turn a butch lesbian into where you deny the fact that it's a lesbian sexuality and turn it into a heterosexual one. And they've already covered this by simply saying this, of course, is not conversion therapy. So we already have 2 new laws, and of course, these laws are going to have an effect on any new transsexual law. The new transsexual law is going to be called Law on Sexual Self-Determination because it sounds better, and this is where we're at. So feminists have now established contact to some of these committees in order to influence the new law.
I wanted to tell you that the situation in Spain is getting more worrying by the day. We do have a law already that allows for the change of the legal gender, provided some requirements are met, which is diagnosed by a psychologist, hormonal treatment for 2 years, an absence of other mental issues that could be influencing the dysphoria of the person. But surgery is not required. But the activists are pushing to change that into self-ID. I have to explain maybe as an intro that we have different levels of government in Spain, similar to the states in the US or the Länder in Germany. So regions have a certain amount of autonomy in order to pass their own legislation on certain topics. It's like what happens in Scotland with devolved matters. So we have 17 of such regions, which we call autonomous communities, and in 14 of them, there is legislation that regulates transgender issues, most of them even allowing self-ID. But luckily, those laws only work within the scope of those devolved matters that are specifically regulated by the regions, which are mainly health and education. This means that students at school or high school could change their name and pronouns, or that medical or healthcare cards could be issued with the new identity chosen by the trans person. But trans activists are pushing very hard for a central or federal law that would unite and harmonize all the regulation in Spain, but also would enforce self-ID into our law. Now in Spain, we have a coalition government, the first one in our recent history, and both parties have distributed, so we could say, the ministries among them. The problem is that the party called Podemos, that is pushing very hard for self-ID into Spanish law, is the one that is ruling over the equality department. Sources from the ministry announced that last week that they will carry out 3 different pieces of legislation for the LGBT community. One of them will be called Against Discrimination and LGTB Phobia. There's another one for equal treatment, and there's another which is just referred as trans law. They have said that they will include self-ID in one of them. They didn't say exactly in which one. And even there's now a public consultation open for Spanish people with very, very little information about the LGBT the equality for LGBT persons and non-discrimination. But this comes with a twist, because the grounds for to be protected are sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, but also sexual characteristics, which is quite odd considering that they usually deny the existence of sex. So we have to see how that works out. So this very week, this Monday, coinciding with Pride, 2 very important LGBT organizations had a meeting with the Minister for Equality, and they staged the delivery of a draft of a bill. And I say staged because the text they gave, they handed over the minister was the same text the party that nowadays is running the Ministry of Equality registered before a parliament 2 years ago. That proposal decayed last year when the parliament was dissolved because of the call for early elections that we had in 2019. So the whole thing was a sort of PR event to have an excuse to have a press release to the media, pictures and such, because of course the government knew perfectly well the text. So they're doing all these public efforts, not only to show the commitment to gender identity politics for the general public, but also because there is disagreement within the political parties that are governing together in a coalition. The Socialist Party, which is very similar to Labour in the UK, is officially supporting the push for self-ID that Podemos, the other party, is pushing for. But it appears to be some resistance from within the party to accept it, because at the beginning of June, some socialist officials published a 4-page manifesto with the title "Arguments Against Theories That Deny the Reality of Women." So that was a good news for all feminists. In that manifesto, they stated that sex is a biological fact and gender is a social construction. That caused anger from their partners from the woke party, as I said, it's called Podemos, so much that, imagine, this is a situation in Spain, yesterday or Thursday, this very week as well, a regional parliamentary of the party in Andalusia, which is at the south of Spain, she was defending trans rights in a speech, and she was at the parliament, and she was wearing a t-shirt with the letters FCK-TRF, which reads as "fuck TERF." She claims to be a feminist, and she happens to live in a region where the government is a right-wing coalition of 3 parties that include the fascistic right-wing party Vox, who are nostalgics from Franco times. But she decided to attack feminists instead of that far right. So this is how polarized things are here so far.
Welcome from New Zealand. And I'm going to start again with transgender medicine guidelines, but a couple of things. One of them is that this whole issue has had very little media coverage. And I'm kind of astonished to hear that the recent laws and changes that have happened in Germany and in Spain, because just in the last week, we also have been fighting a bit of a phony war for about 6 or 7 months. And just in the last week, 3 or 4 big things have happened. But I'll just talk first of all about the guidelines for transgender medicine. They were issued in 2018, and they were published on the Ministry of Health website. They're more extreme, I believe, or more progressive, I guess, depending on your viewpoint, than in most other places. They were co-created with the transgender community. They advocate for early social transition. They completely ignore diagnosis in favour of self-identification supported by medical affirmation. And they often support young people, and that the language in the standard is kind of along the lines of supporting people to their unique journey to the destination that they choose. Pre-existing and untreated mental health conditions, and even the ability to verbalize your kind of beliefs about your own sexuality are no bar to treatment. And there are some very odd arrangements for informed consent. And there's no information yet. There hasn't been anything in New Zealand kind of raising awareness of the dangers of puberty blockers or anything. So lots of, my hometown is Wellington, the capital, and it's probably second only to Brighton in the UK in the numbers of young people transitioning. There are no national statistics. And we know that the transgender medicine services in New Zealand are highly devolved, even to regional district health boards, and also to small boutique services that are dedicated to providing services for young people. With a very small population, there'd be very few professional people who don't know of a family with a transgender child, and teachers are observing rapid onset and social contagion that has been observed elsewhere. Now, this is kind of important in terms of self-identification. Self-identification hasn't been passed into law. It was about to be passed in 2018-19. And as a result of the Speak Up for Women campaign, by and large, it was the changes to include self-ID were put into the bill after the select committee process, which meant that there wasn't the opportunity for a proper consultation. And when we managed to campaign on that, eventually the law was deferred. But a little bit like the situation in Scotland, and many of you will be familiar with the article by Kath Murray and Lucy Hunter Blackburn, the article about the unregulated introduction of self-ID and the fact that women's rights have been lost sight of. Well, we're pretty much in that kind of situation in New Zealand as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about Speak Up for Women, as well as the deferral of the formal self-ID legislation. We've also been able to ensure that there was a carve out in the anti-conversion therapy bill so that it won't go through unless there is some criteria for addressing gender identity issues for young children and young people. Although we know full well that many professionals are actually suggesting, you know, doctors, social workers, counsellors are actually talking to either kids or their parents and saying, well, oh, do you think you might be trans? We were able to retain the word woman in the abortion legislation. Abortion was decriminalised recently. And we think that our responses to the Universal Periodic Reviews, the UN process, were instrumental in those related to transgender women being noted, but not being adopted. So one of the kind of hopeful things is where there is a proper democratic process, we are able to be quite influential. But the three things that have happened in the last week, firstly, and this isn't something that's happened, we've discovered that the Ministry for Women has changed its definition of woman to a self-identification definition. And the level of arrogance about the way that this has happened, we asked an Official Information Act question, not myself, but somebody that shared it with me. And there was no prior notification, there was no research, there was no risk assessment, there was no policy process, they couldn't name a date on which the decision had been made. And moreover, they didn't notify any of their stakeholders through a newsletter or in any other way. So we think they're on fairly kind of dodgy ground by doing that. And I think that we will be able to raise awareness of that over the next month. The second thing that happened last week was that gender has been the change to the gender and sex definition, both for use across government and for use in the next census, is going through its final process of consultation. And the decision there, or the provisional decision, which we will have to submit against, is the idea that gender identity becomes subsumed under gender as an overarching concept. And the idea is that we will use the same kind of statistical arrangements as Canada, which is somewhat worrying. And then the other thing that's come out in the last week has been that pronouns, the State Services Commission, which is the part of government that mandates good process for people right across the public sector, has come out and with a sort of one pager that tells the whole public sector that they're intended to use pronouns to demonstrate their allyship, and that if anybody has received negative information about trying to use pronouns, that they should talk to their HR department. So it's setting up a kind of reporting framework for monitoring people who don't believe in gender identity. There's more than that. Passports and driver's licenses were awarded to transgender people just on self-notificate, kind of a filling in a form. And that happened back in 2013. Yeah, so one of the things which I'm very hopeful about is where we get the opportunity to comment, we are being quite successful, and that, but by and large, a lot of this stuff has taken place completely under the radar until it gets to the point where it's announced.
Denmark we have legal gender change since 2014, and that is poor self-identification. You just have to apply for it and wait half a year and then apply again, and it is true. And it's funny because it's very hard to get to be a Danish citizen then you have to live in Denmark for 9 years and make a test and have no criminal record. But it's very, very easy to change your legal gender. This law was forced through the Danish parliament during a government crisis, where everybody was talking about the crisis and nobody about gender change, legal gender change. It was sold by the activists as being about giving transgender people the possibility to have correct ID papers, so that they can travel easier and get a parcel down at the post and so on. And nobody was talking about changing rooms and showers, because the activists were saying that trans women are so ashamed of their genitals that they will never show up in any showering room for women. The legal implications of this law are very unclear, because they were never solved in parliament. Last year we had a case of a convicted rapist who changed his gender to female and wanted to be moved to a female prison. But the Danish prison authorities said no, they were not allowed it. And the Danish LGBT plus organization was very angry, but they could do nothing about it, because it seems to be so that it is up to the providers if they will accept this gender change in gender diverse, what call it, gender separated or sex separated institutions. But I found out a few days ago that all Danish shelters for homeless women now accept a transgender woman, and then that the women there are very unhappy, but that is so it is, and nobody listens to this way vulnerable women. Last summer, there was a drive from the trans activists to change the law so that also children can change their legal gender. And they wanted no under age limit, so that 2-year-old children should be able to change their legal gender if their parents wanted it. But they were so stupid to take the debate during summertime, where people had a lot of time to discuss it. And so it somehow died out. All of a sudden, nobody was talking about it anymore. But I'm afraid that they are just waiting for better times to try again.